All right, so this is kind of a revamp on another panel that we did, at the other Dreamworld event in Istanbul a few days ago. But I think with this particular crowd, this could be even more interesting. So I'm going to start by asking, how many people in here contribute or have contributed to an open source project? Which I imagine is, it's Ethereum, right? I mean, we've all contributed in some way, shape, or form in this decentralized ecosystem. That's what it's all about. How many people have been paid full time for contributing to an open source project? Okay, it's a much smaller show of hands, but that's kind of what we would expect. So, okay, one last question. How many people feel like they have very strong opinions about open source in this crowd? Okay, congratulations. You three just volunteered yourselves, so come on up. All right, so we're doing this fishbowl style. If you guys have never done a fishbowl style panel before, the premise is basically this. We want to have everybody here engaged. And if you have a burning thing that you want to come up and say in response to some question that somebody said, you come up, you approach one of the seats of somebody who's already sitting up here. And if they're not currently talking, you just swap seats, you sit down, they get to sit down back in the audience, and we'll just keep moving forward this way. So, thank you. I guess we'll start by just introducing myself and our lovely brand new minted panelists here. My name is Maxwell. I'm a developer relations at Near Developer Hub. Basically, we're just a kind of a DAO, but basically just trying to open up contributions to open source software, building in the open, and really committing to these open source ideals, because something that we really want to see more in this space is developers who can both work on their passion, but also do so in such a way that the amount of work, the amount of passion that goes into it is kind of fair and fairly compensated, and also visible to those who also care equally and who can maybe come and also get involved. Would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Luke. Worked on Ethereum and Polkadot projects primarily. I spend most of my time looking for issues and new projects to try out, open source ones, of course. And I get a real kick out of responsiveness of maintainers of those repositories too. So I guess if I look at a repository and it's a really old one, it hasn't been maintained, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something that I can still use. But I guess if somebody responds, it might also kickstart, or I might be redirected somewhere else. So that's my general background.
Hi everyone, my name is Artem. I'm working as a tech lead at a project called Octant, built by Golem Foundation. I have been contributing to the Web3 space since 2017, working on the protocol layers and application layer. And I'm really excited about public good space and open source as well,
Hey, so my name is Tomas. I'm working at an Argentinian company called Lambda Class, where I'm working now full-time on a consensus client for Ethereum in Elixir, which is open source, which is the reason I'm here apparently. I contributed to open source projects before the Ethereum space as well. I contributed to Kafka-related libraries, got those PRs merged a couple of weeks ago, and then participated in some Elixir-related Ethereum APIs, and I was working on that before, and none of those were paid, but now I'm being currently paid full-time for open source code. So,
Well, let's hear it for that, getting paid full-time for open source. All right, awesome. I just kind of want to go down the line, because I think this is something that a lot of people really care about, and a lot of people who don't think about it deeply probably should, I think, open source software, because I think there's a lot of fear maybe in software in general that open sourcing things means that other people can steal your work, can start taking your value, can steal your customers, all that sort of thing. And there may be some genuine concern to that, but there's also a lot of benefits, I think, to open source, and it's not just all altruistic stuff either. I guess in your words, why do you think that open source is important?
I always reflect upon like managing self and others, and thinking about your future self as well. So if I work on a project and it's closed source, and I spend a lot of time and energy on it, and I'm working on a team, and something happens and it's not available, then I've effectively wasted a lot of time. And whether it's not important or important, so I think that's primarily, it's, I guess, a form of caring. I don't whether it's your family or your friends or your ecosystem. If I'm going to spend time on something, I want it to be available. Yeah.
I think around 99% of current software has some open source software running in them, like Android systems, etc. And those people have not been rewarded fairly, obviously, for their contribution to that. There is a way to kind of take leverage from and take advantage from their work, but from other point of view, I think the open source software enabled access to so many technologies these days and so many tools and applications that probably it wouldn't have been possible without people contributing and sharing their work publicly. So I think we definitely need to find better ways to reward those people, and at the same time think that positive sum games are possible, and it's better to build something, share it in public, and try to build on top of each other than just trying to sit in the corner and build your own thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, well, there are many reasons why open source is, I would say, necessary. Like learning, for instance, you are a new dev, like your Ethereum path is just starting, like there's so much code available for you just to learn and get to know the ecosystem. Also to making oneself known, like for instance, if you contribute to open source spaces, then you get your name out there, people start seeing the quality of your code, and that's also like good for your own marketing in a way. But also as you were saying before, almost any piece of code that you make is using open source somewhere. And if you have a bug, in one of those source libraries, you can always go check the code, make a PR. In the other case, if you're purely using closed source libraries, then you have a bug in those, and that's it. Yeah, that's the end of the road. You just need to change libraries completely, and there's no other option, or build a workaround around it. So yeah, and for everything that's not app related but protocol related, I think that open source is a necessity for transparency. Like you cannot trust a protocol for which you do not know the code.
I think that's actually a really interesting and good point. Like the resiliency of open source code, I think is really something that can't be overstated enough. Like closed source code can be very brittle sometimes, and you're really relying on secrecy to just not exploit your code. Something that's kind of beautiful about Ethereum and all these other blockchains that are out there and them being open source is that we really are saying to the world, you can trust this. You can look at the whole thing. You can see it right there, and it works, and it's reasonably safe. And you can, come and verify and improve on that if you want to. I'm going to mix up the format a little bit because I'm not sure if people are eager enough to come up. If you guys want to pick somebody else from the audience and sit down, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that as well. So, pick a spicy topic. Okay, let's see. Yeah? You want to?
So I want to take issue with the framing of this as open source.
Okay.
Right? So open source is just a demoralized, depoliticized version of free software. Right? So Richard Stallman, a controversial figure these days because he's autistic and not particularly well-mannered, defined 4 freedoms that were human rights relative to technology. Now, can we remember what those 4 freedoms are? Anybody know the 4 freedoms? Yeah. So that is the total destruction of Stallman's work on human rights, as the concept of free software, which is a rights-based argument, was replaced with open source, which is not a rights-based argument. So the decision that we had software under these licenses as a way of pragmatically developing software and auditing software and being able to inspect software was a destruction of Stallman's idea of open source, of free software, by the concept of open source. And the replacement of the concept of open source, you know, there was a war fought about whether this software would be seen as a human rights expression, which was free software, or whether it was going to just be seen as a pragmatic thing, which was open source. And a guy called Eric Raymond basically stabbed Stallman in the neck, and as a result, we keep reinventing the idea that people that use software should have some kind of human rights access. And Stallman's 4 freedoms, is, if I remember them correctly, are you have the right to use the program, you can modify the source code, you can give away your modifications. And you know, you could do what I'm actually going to look them up in a second on my phone. I should have looked them up before I talked about it. But you know, why are we as an industry that's interested in human rights, that's interested in freedom, that's interested in free expression, using the open source terminology rather than reviving the spirit of free software and actually making a stand on the human rights argument?
That's kind of an interesting point. So basically what you're saying is like the licensing, for instance, that we have now isn't actually as open source as maybe the ideal makes it out to be. Am I kind of understanding your gist?
The question is why these licenses, right? So if you think of these licenses as just existing for pragmatic reasons, then people are only going to argue about whether or not a given solution is pragmatic. It's basically a utilitarian argument, right? Stallman's argument is that it is a moral argument and that it's a kind of deontological ethics argument. So freedom 0, the freedom to use the program for any purpose. Freedom 1, the freedom to study how the program works and change it to do what you wish. Freedom 2, the freedom to distribute and make copies so you can help your neighbor. Freedom 3, the freedom to improve the program and release improvements and modified versions in general to the public so the whole community benefits. So everything that we think of as being open source was built on top of the foundation of free software, but they removed the concept of the 4 freedoms, they removed the discussion of human rights, they removed the idea that software was something that you had human rights about. The total cultural erasure of Stallman's work, I mean, he was the guy that first wrote the licenses that enabled us to build things like Unix. You know, there's a fundamental attempt to get Stallman out of the history because Stallman is inconvenient, because Stallman has some morals.
But where's the line between software that like should be free for humanity and software where like devs are just working free for corporations, and they do like Rust and Mozilla?
This is the big problem, right? So, as you know, when free software was basically hippies in the 1970s, 1980s. You know, exchanging source code for programs on floppy disks. You know, the idea that there was a lot of money to be made in software was very weird looking. Then you got the split between the free software folks on one side, who were mostly employed by universities, and the commercial software houses like Microsoft on the other, and there was a whole round of war between free software and commercial software development. Eventually what happened was that the open source guys came in and basically negotiated a peace and said, hey, corporations, you don't have to think about any of this human rights stuff. Just use the software under these licenses and you can then get your developers working on it. So that process of an enormous transfer of wealth, I mean, I talked to Stallman about this in London about 10 years ago. I hosted him for a talk, and Stallman said, look, all of the money made in Silicon Valley was made by hijacking software that had been written and put into the commons. There was a bug in the license. This is one of the things that got me interested in law. So the bug in the license is this. If you have a free software word processor and you modify it to add a spell checker and then you attempt to sell it, you're legally required to distribute the source code under an open license. If, on the other hand, you take that word processor and you serve it to somebody over an internet connection on a web page, so the software stays on your computer and you just provide software as a service, the free software licenses do not cover that as a case, and you can keep your source code private. And not the AJPL fixes the bug. right? GPL has the bug, GPL fixes the bug. Stallman says $1 trillion of value slipped out of the commons because of that bug in the license. And if they had anticipated the problem, Silicon Valley would have been basically a socialist utopia in which all the source code to Google was available for anybody. Because the alternative would have been that Google wouldn't have to write the entire stack right down to the operating system for itself. So, you know, blockchain is a kind of chance to re-examine these questions because there's enough money, there's enough power, there's enough reach, there's enough sophistication to be able to say, okay, what would it look like to fix the problem in free software, right? The AGPL problem, but also what do you do when huge corporations are running entire businesses on source code written by somebody for a PhD thesis that they released into the commons, and then it became hugely important. And, you know, we've got all these crypto economic tools. Can we find a way of squaring the circle and having a system that respects human rights, but maybe begins to put pressure on corporate users? Like, could you have a license that simply says, individual users have these rights, corporations don't? I don't know. But if anybody is going to solve that problem, it's probably going to be the blockchain community, because the commercial software industry has completely encapsulated and captured open source. They've destroyed the legacy of free software, and now the world runs on corporate open source.
Well, something that comes to mind is additional licenses that are governed on-chain through on-chain decision making, and you programmatically generate that based on on-chain decision making, and it gets certain versions get stored on-chain and upgraded based on votes, and I guess you could people could put some stake on how much they feel towards in the community feel towards certain licenses or proportions of those licenses, depending on different areas. You could have like hotspots of certain licenses that might introduce risk, and then that could raise a discussion about, again, another vote. Yeah.
I really have a question for you. So, I mean, there was free software first, and then open source, and then we understand that the world is not perfect, right? And the open source also created a lot of value, but also created a lot of inequality, as you mentioned, right? So a lot of corporations were able to take advantage, and those people like never were rewarded. Do you see like any like practical way to in this community, in the blockchain community, to like redistribute the value, redistribute the wealth that those corporations actually like took from the open sourcer at this point in time? Because they protected by like different legal ways and the laws and the licenses, et cetera, and also it requires a lot of like social pressure, I think, to be able to say like, no, we want to kind of go back to the roots and somehow like change the way people like treat this software, that software.
So for the software that's already licensed, it's already licensed. The cat is out of the bag. You know, the software has gone, and there's probably no way of getting it back, right? But if you think about the amount of software that's going to get written in the blockchain space and the AI space over the next 10 years, it's going to be the construction of an entirely new universe. And we could take the open source model and we could have programmers that write vital things that wind up making no kind of income from those things. We could have corporate capture. You know, eventually Google and Apple are likely to release wallets for Android and iOS. Right? And those wallets are almost certainly going to be based on open source software that other people developed, in the same way that, you know, the Apple operating system that runs on Apple laptops is a fork of BSD, Darwin. So we could, in theory, get ahead of this problem, right? You could have a kind of blockchain public license, and this, I'll also come back to Bored Apes in a second. We could have a blockchain public license where we got together a bunch of really good lawyers and we said, right, take a look at this problem, take a look at the property rights, take a look at existing licenses, take a look at copyright law, draft a new license that has some mechanism of compensating programmers if corporations are using their work. And it could be a situation where if you're a corporation and you're using this software, you need to be a member of a body and you have to pay 0.5% of profit into that body, and that's then redistributed to programmers, or something like that. Almost like the compulsory licensing schemes that are common for intellectual property in some jurisdictions. There could be ways of doing it. While we're at it, let me also throw some mega shade on the Bored Apes. If the Bored Apes had hired a lawyer and spent 50 or 100 grand getting an IP license together, when you bought a Bored Ape, you could have gotten an unquestionable, transferable property right that allowed you to commercially exploit the intellectual property of the ape by putting the ape in movies and video games and everything else. And at that point, when you bought a Bored Ape, you would have got a thing of identifiable value that you could make money with. And that Bored Ape public license would likely have become the standard license for all NFT projects. Because the Bored Apes did such a lousy job on the legals, it was not clear when you bought a Bored Ape that you had actually purchased anything that resembled legal property, and it certainly wasn't clear that you could go out and license that character to Disney to go make a TV show with. And this kind of slipshod attitude towards the law basically is why the NFT markets are substantially dead, rather than being thriving new hubs where people have basically an eBay for intellectual property. We have to get this stuff right. We have to get it right in software licensing. We have to get it right in, IP licensing for things like NFTs. I've spent, 6 years of my life fixing it so that you can do purchase and fractionalization of real estate in 172 countries, fully licensed and regulated. And the amount of time and labor and effort that it took to get that done is insane. But IP licensing is it's literally a 2-month job with an ordinary law firm. It's not that hard. Nobody cared enough to do it. And I think if we look back in 10 years, the opportunity to get all of this blockchain infrastructure onto a license which is better suited for the future than, say, GPL v3, there's an opportunity to do something there. Maybe we should give it a try.
So I'm a VC, and I get paid to invest, and that's my job, and I volunteer as a community organizer, and no one pays me to do this, but it takes over most of my life. Who pays the open source devs if the corporations are using their software?
Nobody right now. Right now, nobody's paid.
That's actually exactly what I wanted to kind of pivot to next, right? Because it's great that we think of this idea of kind of trying to take software back for the people, of really making these ecosystems open and letting everybody use software as, say, a human right, But the fact of the matter right now is that capital and Silicon Valley are really, really enmeshed and intertwined right now. And as a good software developer, that is a powerful incentive gap to overcome, to go and contribute to something free and open instead of potentially cashing in for a huge bag from all of these capital interests that really would love you to get in there and just extract the shit out of whatever you can, So I wonder, as far as mechanistically speaking, how do we kind of try to wrest some of the power back? And I think it's an interesting kind of exploration that we've been doing with some of these DAOs, maybe in terms of distributing these governance in such ways, trying to be more egalitarian, quadratic voting, not just giving all the money to the people with the capital, being a little bit more careful and deliberate with who's getting equity and who's getting not equity, I suppose. But it's also really tricky because people, at a bare minimum, they have to eat, they have to live. But many people are more ambitious than that and would also like to live in a nice place or have a family or something like that. So this is really tricky to, what do you think about what we can do to open up the people who are capable of doing this work to really put more time and effort into it?
Yeah, I'd like to answer, and then I see a hand there. Maybe you can come here after that. So I'm working right now in the public good space, and we have this conversation with different projects and protocols of thinking of how do we fund different public goods project, what is public good, and how do we fund open source software as well. And one of the projects that is doing the distribution of the rewards to open source software project called DRIPS. So they create this list where you can fund your dependencies. So that's kind of one of the narratives. If you're using open source software, you can create a list and a smart contract, and you can funnel the funds to them, and they can just go and claim it. And they not necessarily have to have like a wallet address. They have an Oracle mechanism where you can send funds directly to their GitHub account, and they can go and claim it. And then we had this panel in Istanbul where the guy from Optimism was sharing his experience about like retro PGF, right? And they decided to distribute some of the funding to open source project, to their dependencies. So they came up with like 1,000 or something projects, and they reach out to all of them. Hey, this is like a magic internet money. Go and like claim them. We will just need like KYC for this, that. And that most people say like, no, thank you. Like some people are afraid. Maybe there's this. I don't know like why, but people actually haven't claimed that. But one way or another, for those people to kind of receive the value that comes from the blockchain, there needs to be like, I guess, like a narrative and education and creation of mechanisms to distribute, and for those people to be able to receive that.
And definitely some level of legal security, right? Like I'm
Obviously,
sure a lot of reasons that people aren't
from both
accepting
sides,
that,
right? So
know?
from the sides who distribute the funds, from the sides who receive the funds. But I think like I'm more optimistic now on our ability to create different protocols and mechanisms that will allow us to like fund open source software and like fund the dependencies. If you use that, like send a chunk of your like revenue to the open source software that you use. Yeah.
Hi everyone. This conversation kind of like made me think of years ago, talking to a friend that is working on open source software, has a foundation that deals with metadata, and kind of like explain his business model. Because I was like, okay, how do you make money? How do you sustain it? How do you have like a team of developers working for you? And the way that he explained it, which also kind of like brings me back to sometimes we don't need to reinvent stuff. Sometimes we can look at the existing world and what people are actually actively using and maybe adapt some of it. But essentially, so it deals with metadata, and he has a license model where, you know, if you're an individual, you don't pay nothing. If you're a corporation of a certain size, you pay something. If you're a little bit bigger, you pay another thing. And if you're like, you know, one of the GAFAs, you pay a little bit more. And maybe that's not, you know, billions in dollars, but so far, like years ago, I knew that he had $500,000 worth of budget for every year, so it could, you know, function properly. And I know that also he had like the support of a lot of those, you know, head of open source projects at those big companies that are like, we just love, like, keep doing what you do. If you ever have any issues, like, call me, we'll write you a check, you know, because they want the work, because the work is high quality and they're using it every day, right? So I think there are ways to do this where it's probably more collaborative, you know, but we need to get our act together and like structure it properly so that, you know, when they interact with us, they don't see, you know, a sheep that is ready to be slaughtered, but like somebody that they can support and use their product and be sure that, you know, they can have some input also in the maybe like some of the features that they would need, and then you can kind of like build on that. But I'm not even sure that, because at some point I was like, what, I am not buying you? Well, maybe they don't necessarily want to do it in-house, they just want to use something. So I guess what I'm saying is like, let's look in the existing world what is available, and let's apply it to us.
No, that's some very good points. I'm sort of thinking that kind of made me think about some of these very big corporations that now own some of these very big open source repositories of these pieces of software that like nearly everybody uses these days. I don't know how we're doing for time. I kind of want to ask though, there was this big idea that occurred to me watching a video from DEF CON 31. If you could open source all of the software, like just mandate it, like, what do you think? Would you do it?
I mean, it's not unrealistic, right? So one way that this could happen is if there's a clear decision that the output from AI systems cannot be copyrighted, and as more software is written using AIs, you wind up in a position where software loses copyright. And that means there's no way of protecting it other than trade secrecy, and that doesn't work because you can have effective decompilers that can take a binary and turn it back into source code. So it's not unrealistic that it could happen just as a result of a legal decision that AI systems can't generate copyrighted works.
I know that's a... Yeah, go ahead.
You know, it's very interesting that you sort of... Okay. So just a quick comment on that, right? We are in the Czech Republic, and in the 1940s, they effectively made that decision around property rights, right? And very often, the discussion, even in the DAO ecosystem around compensation, hovers around reward for reputation and other mechanisms. We do have to be very careful about the mechanisms that we invent because they do mirror prior experiences and prior understandings of like what people have done that have turned out very poorly. So when we talk about the sort of like, what if we got rid of, closed source software? I think the parallels to the what if we got rid of private ownership of, things is very actually similar. And it's very useful to think about what the world would look like if that did happen, especially when, property rights in the future are going to be more over IP than they are going to be over physical things.
Yeah, I think it's a it's a difficult topic, right? Like you can spend hours and hours and hours, weeks, years probably thinking about this sort of thing because we are trying to build a better world, but we also want to make sure that everybody who is building it can live both in terms of being able to live in the society that we live in and being able to feed your soul at the same time. All right, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for your participation.